It seemed appropriate to share this week something that Max Lucado put together a number of years ago. He called it the Survivor's Creed. It goes this way: you'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for something good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. Don't give up. Because with God's help, you will get through this. How do you know that? Have you seen the news lately? Do you know what my life is? It's not just blind faith and optimism. It's the biblical truth, seen in the story of a young man whose life was in a pit so deep he couldn't get out on his own. You may have heard of him. His name was Joseph. It begins in Genesis 37, verses 23 and 24. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off his robe of many colors and threw him into a dry well pit. Many years later, his brothers would finally admit the truth. We saw his trouble, and when he begged us to save him, we refused to listen. Genesis 42, verse 21. Why would a family treat each other that way? I mean, after all, this wasn't your family or my family. This was the family chosen by God for His special blessing. They were the descendants of Abraham. The problem was, they had forgotten God at that point in their life because of the pain in their life. The thing is, that's what pain usually does to us. It gives us spiritual amnesia so that we forget our blessings. Their father had shown so much favoritism to Joseph that it tore the whole family apart, just like his brothers would later tear Joseph's robe apart, claiming that a wild animal must have killed him. You see, the backstory there is that Joseph's mother was Rachel, and she was the love of his father's life. When she died, he coped with his grief by keeping her memory alive by showering all of his attention and love on her son Joseph, to the exclusion of the rest of the family. You might even say that he was blinded by his grief, unable to see any other blessing currently in his life or any other blessing that would be coming to him through any of the other family members. But likewise, Joseph was blindsided as well. His blessed life had made him so oblivious to others that he got caught up in how great his own life was and never saw what was coming because of the pain in their life. He was completely caught off guard when he was thrown into a pit, literally. But Joseph wasn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last one to be blindsided by life's pitfalls. It still happens all the time. We think our life's going great until it's not. Just like a trap door that falls out from underneath us, or a rug that pulls out from under us, or stepping on a piece of ice on the steps coming out of the house, the next thing we know, we're looking up flat on our back. The test results come back, the doctor's office calls us, and all of a sudden, you're in a pit. You're called into the office at work, and then walked out like a criminal with a cardboard box in your hand with all of your personal possessions. The letter comes from a lawyer. You're being sued for divorce. All of a sudden, you find yourself paying final notices instead of monthly bills. If that sounds familiar to you in your life, welcome to the pit. Say hello to the guy over in the corner. His name's Joseph. Life couldn't get much darker in that pit for him. The walls around were too steep. He'd tried repeatedly to climb out on his own. He called out over and over for somebody to help, for somebody to rescue, and nobody was listening. Or if they were listening, they just didn't care. You see, when your life is in the pit, it seems like you're living out that old comedy line. Cheer up, they said. Things could be worse. So I cheered up. You know the rest of it. And sure enough, things got worse. And that's the way it was for Joseph as well. His life got worse before it got better. And then it got worse again, and then it got better again, and then it got worse again. You see, it was a repeated cycle all throughout his life. He was sold out and then enslaved. He made his way out of that to a place of respectability, and then he got caught up in the trap and the jealousy of another woman. Things went bad again. He found himself in prison, and then he got sucker punched by somebody who promised that they'd help him out, and then he was disappointed by the people that he trusted the most, who broke their promises over and over again. Every single time he just would resolve, I'll just keep my head down, I'll do my best, and things will probably get better. And yet somehow he ended up being treated worse each and every time. But despite his disappointments, Joseph never gave up on God. He refused to allow his circumstances to make him bitter toward God. His heart never hardened, but regardless of the repetitious cycle, year after year, seeing his life thrown back into yet another pit and another pit and another pit, he never gave up on God. It was because of his trust in God that no matter what happened, he eventually would stand out from his surroundings in a way that, by the way that he served. You see, he just didn't survive. He learned to thrive, no matter what his circumstances were. Every time his life ended up in a pit, people would inevitably recognize his character and his credibility and how that made him stand out from everyone else around. Humiliated and sold as a slave, he became a trusted manager of a whole household. Imprisoned because they didn't trust him, and yet eventually he was trusted enough again to be in charge of all of the prisoners. Forgotten, abandoned, he eventually found himself being trusted enough to be named, you might even say, vice president over crisis management. If they had the coronavirus in Egypt, he would have been in charge of the committee to solve it. You see, by the end of his life, Joseph was no longer the boy in the pit. Now he had become the palace prince. He single-handedly saved an entire nation because of what God did through him. How? Was it because he had so much wisdom, so much insight? Because his life was so blessed? He did it the same way each and every one of us will do it. With God's help, he got through his time in the pit. Later in life, Joseph had the opportunity to confront his family. Here's how he described it in Genesis 50. "You meant to hurt me, but God turned your evil into good to save the lives of many people," which was being done today. Joseph used an interesting word to describe what God did through his life. Depending on the translation you read, it might say that God turned it or God intended it, but the word literally means to weave, like a thread in a tapestry, to fabricate, to design. You see, the reality is, Satan brings pain into our life on a repeated basis. With every opportunity presented to him, every time he thinks maybe now would be the right time to throw us into the pit again, his intention is to destroy our life by destroying our faith. And yet, like Joseph, we'll see over time that God weaves the broken threads of our life into his tapestry. You see, our God can create good from evil. He can recreate what's become bad into something that's amazing. Joseph's life had been a series of pivotal crossroads. Because of the frayed threads of the family dynamics, his brothers brought evil into his life. But God took his most painful moment and began to reweave it into something beautiful. The eventual result, everything that was wrong in his life became everything that was right. The worst possible thing became the most amazing thing. Everything that he hated about what was bad in his life became the best thing about his life. The story of Joseph teaches this one simple truth: God is greater than any pitfall in your life. People in this world can be heartless. Joseph certainly learned that, even when those people were in his own family. That happens because of the influence of evil. It's certainly not original, but it certainly is true. Hurt people hurt people. It's only a matter of time before that happens to each one of us. These hurt people will take advantage of every opportunity to use you for their own benefit, hoping that maybe somehow they won't hurt anymore if they can get an advantage through you. And they do so without regard for how it impacts your life, your feelings, or even your future. Because of the example of Joseph, we can trust that God will use those same threads of evil to reweave the fabric of our life. God recycles, He redeems the broken parts of our life, He recreates us into His image for His purpose, for His glory, and for His honor throughout the ages. Jesus would later share that same worldview in this passage in John 16. I told you all this so that you may have peace in me. In this world you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. You see, when our world has been interrupted and turned upside down, we struggle with worry that it might never get better. We might never get better. We might never be able to get over it. We might never be able to get out of the pits. It not only scares us to think it might not get better, we begin to wonder, am I ever going to get better at dealing with it? And if I can't deal with it, then I won't know how to get through it. The good news is that through seems to be one of God's favorite words. God walked His people through the Red Sea. God walked His people through the fiery furnace. God gets us through the storm when we're exhausted and scared. God even gets His own child through betrayal, false accusation, abuse, the public humiliation and crucifixion, death, and even through the tomb. You see, one of the recurring themes throughout the whole Bible is this: God loves to prove to us that we can always count on Him by helping us get through the pitfalls of this life. Some people would think, well, if I could count on God, then I should never have to be in the pit. Kind of like God was a lucky rabbit's foot or that genie in the bottle. But the character of God counts more than that. The character of God is what tells us we can count on Him because He's faithful and true. Sure, there'll be hard times. There'll be tears. There'll be fears. And there'll be failures. But God does guarantee that with His help, you'll get through it. Not only will He help you through it, but later His promise is that He will actually use it for something good to help others through their pit as well. It may seem like God takes His good, sweet time, but know this to be true: God never wastes His time. It took 100 years for God to get Noah through the abuse that he encountered while building the ark out of obedience to His command. It took 40 years for God to get Moses through his struggle with low self-esteem and failure and bring him to a point where he was willing to go back to Egypt and lead his people to freedom. It took another 40 years for God to help His people through the wilderness. And even after sending His own Son to save the world, it took 30 years of waiting and preparing for Him to come to the fullness of time, when it was the right time for Him to die for our sins. God knows, God cares, and God is always at work. I've said it before, and it's worth repeating again, because that principle is still true. Hang on to your hope in God. He will get you through it. You see, God made sure that the story of Joseph would be told throughout the centuries, so that we would learn this lesson about trusting Him. It doesn't matter how deep the pit is that you're in. It doesn't matter how mean the people were to put you there. It doesn't matter how deep their betrayal cut you, or how unfair it is that you're there, or how devastating it is that you've lost everything and have to start over again. It doesn't matter if the rest of your life seems to be on repeat, repeat, repeat. God always overcomes evil. And with God's help, because of that, He and we will get through it. Don't give up on God. Just keep trusting Him for peace in the midst of it. Because that same God who rescued Joseph from his pit will also rescue you. That's the basis of that survivor's creed I mentioned in the beginning. You'll get through this. It won't be painless. It may not be quick. But God will use this mess for something good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. Just don't give up. Because with God's help, you will get through this. Reach out to us at marysvillechristian.org if you'd like more information about trusting a God who will help you get through this.